It was interesting to listen to Jamie Dimon a few minutes ago urge all the CEOs to go on the morning shows. As someone who once hosted a cable talk show, I can tell you how hard it was, particularly when something controversial was happening, to book any CEO. You know, it's like, let's get under the desk. You know, you're talking transgender bathrooms. You know, you're talking racial riots in Charlottesville. The last thing 10 years ago, 15 years ago, any CEO wanted to do was get caught in a controversial conversation in public. Something has really changed there. Something has changed in the way people in your jobs think about how they do the jobs. Indra, I know you were ahead of a lot of CEOs on this. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, how you see the role having changed.
I think in the last 10 years in particular, as millennials have come into the workforce in large numbers, their expectations of companies have changed. They no longer look at it as sort of a paycheck, but they look at it as, how can I go to work and make a difference in society? So the notion of purpose is becoming a much bigger factor. The big difference is that in the past, purpose used to be some sort of a corporate social responsibility program. And typically those programs were good, people liked them, but they were at the whim or fancy of the CEO who was there. So if the CEO retired, that program got cut. So we had to weave purpose into the core business model of the company. How do you make sure that the sense of purpose can only be accomplished if you make profits? And the only way to make profits is through purpose. And that's why we use the term performance with purpose, linking both together. And I think that's what's excited millennials in particular, and what's excited the boomers to even stay longer in the workforce, because they actually feel they're contributing to the future of society as opposed to walking in, picking a paycheck and leaving. So the whole equation with employees is changing as we see it.
Mark, some of it's driven by millennial employees, clearly. It's also driven by the ecosystem in which you operate. Everything's so much more transparent, so much more open. Social media can so quickly pick apart your actions. How do you think about that as running a large organization?
Yeah, I think the big difference now versus maybe even 7 to 10 years ago is that we run social ecosystems. That the four walls of our corporations no longer are the limits of our communication, nor the area within which we can define truth. And so all of our employees who now today look for people, planet, then profits, have this view of a broader view of how the world works and how we fit within it. And they're influenced by many different factors out there, very many different audiences, many different groups. And so we have a responsibility to have a point of view beyond our four walls. And I think it challenges us to think about whether or not our governance models inside of companies and inside of cities, states, and nations are big enough to handle the social ecosystems that our economies, our governments, and our companies have become.
In asking that question, you're suggesting they are not.
They are not. I don't think they are. And I think one view would be, well, let's create the new world order, which scares the heck out of a lot of people and creates all sorts of protests in the streets. I think it actually has moved to a microcosm, moved smaller, moved to community, moved inside the company. And so our responsibility to lead at a local level, everywhere we are, our responsibility as cities and states, as you're seeing with some of the dynamic around the Paris Climate Accords, is let's step forward and take it into our own hands and move ahead. It's that localization of governance that is going to save us from the new world order, in my view.
The Climate Accord is an interesting one because a dozen years ago when George W. Bush said we weren't going to participate in the Kyoto Accords, there were a fair number of people in the business community who supported him on that. But this time around, when Donald Trump talked about pulling out of the Paris Accord, my understanding is he got a very clear message from big business, at least, that to not engage was a big mistake. You were part of that conversation, Indra. This is not a political meeting. I don't want to get into politics, but it does get to this key question about how do you lead in today's fractious world?
I think the problem with climate change is that when the evidence comes in, when the proof comes in, it's going to be too late to do anything about it. So we can sit here and argue about the science forever, but we don't want the evidence or the proof to really land at our doorstep. From our perspective, as we operate around the world, we see evidence of changes in the environment impacting our business. For example, cities and communities which had plentiful water suddenly go into water distress. What do you do about that community where you have a plant, where you have a business, and you need water to function? You see water levels rising in other areas where it was not supposed to rise. So something is happening. What it is, we don't know, but scientists say it's climate change, and there's evidence to support that. So from our perspective, to get a license to operate in many societies, to be able to continue to function where we are, and to be a responsible citizen of communities, we have to lean in and do things on the environmental front. We can't do it all ourselves. It would help to have the support and the encouragement of local governments and governments across the world.
To change the subject a little bit, I said at the outset that you were early on this. The reason I said that is because I remember very clearly 6 or 7 years ago when you started pushing Pepsi in the direction of healthy foods, and you got hammered by some of your shareholders saying, focus on profits. If you're making more money off of the sugary soft drinks, don't get caught up in political correctness. That was a pretty tough time for you.
Yeah, I mean, what would they say today?
Well, now it looks okay.
Well,
but that requires a 7-year focus.
Well, I think
they were looking quarter to quarter.
No, you're right, Alan. I think every issue we are facing today is long-term in nature and requires systematic solutions. When we have political cycles that are short-term in nature and investors who are short-term in nature. So the question is, who is going to address these issues? We're looking at everything through a microscope, and we've got to look at a microscope and a telescope. So I don't know how we're going to resolve these issues. The political system has its own challenges. Issues are not being addressed, they're not being surfaced. And so companies are trying to do what they can do. I think it requires CEOs to stand up and be courageous. It requires investor support. It requires support from boards of directors. From my perspective, that is the only strategy I knew, and that's the only strategy I know. If my board, my investors didn't like that, I wouldn't be sitting here with you today. But I was very comfortable that that was the only way the company should go, because I was looking at the consumer data, I was looking at societal data, and I realized that our strategy to shift the portfolio, becoming more environmentally conscious and creating an environment that was good for our employees, was the only shareholder value creating strategy in the long term.
Mark, I was at a dinner that honored you a couple of weeks ago, and you made an interesting comment, and I wrote it down. I want to make sure I get it right. I don't want to misquote you. But you said, the capitalist model no longer works. If we don't reinvent it, we will lose it. That's a pretty strong statement.
I did say that, actually. Yeah.
Now,
it's great to actually be quoted truthfully for a change. It's great.
But it was late in the evening. You might have had a couple of glasses of wine.
No. I was stone cold sober when I said that.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I think we have a model today that works for too few people. And what we're seeing happen as a result of the 2008-2009 meltdown in our economy, the laying bare of social determinants of health, where now your zip code matters more than your genetic code as to how your lifestyle goes. You see the opioid epidemic, where 80% of the opioids produced in the world are consumed by Americans. If you added them all up, it could keep us all stoned for 6 weeks as a nation. And when you think about that, there's a loss of hope in our nation around who we are and what our opportunities are. And that is because we haven't brought everybody along with what we call the recovery, one of the longest recoveries we've had. And that's because we haven't shared that in a way to preserve the model that we have. So we have to change it. And we have to look at human capital differently than we've looked at it in the past. Profits are an output. They are not something to be managed. People who just manage their profits are not long-term successful. Aetna is 165 years old. I'm at
people 14. Who just manage it, but people who don't have profits are also not long-term successful.
Right. But profits come out of sound business fundamentals. And in a service economy as large as ours, those sound business fundamentals are run by people, human capital. And yet our investment, our whole investment portfolios, all of our tax laws orient us toward machines, because we get a better deal on investing in machines than we do in people. Mm-hmm. And so people are not as worthy as machines. Why? In a service economy, oh my gosh, I mean, we could We could probably create everything in machines, but then what would we have? And I think becoming our augmented reality and artificial intelligence is going to even challenge us more to think about how we do that.
But so how, Indra, how much can you do as the CEO of a large public company to address that problem? If the system isn't working, I mean, you do have responsibilities to your shareholders. You do have responsibilities to make a profit. How much can you really do to change the way the system operates?
I think that is a central question, Alan. I think what we can do as CEOs is manage the company for both the level of returns and the duration of returns. Because very easy to manage a company for extraordinary returns for a short time, and then it goes flat. And then you can say, I'm retiring just before it goes down. Okay? Easy to do that. But if you want to be a responsible CEO, you've got to manage the company for the level and duration. So a certain level of profits, but last for a long time. There are those who believe that, there are some investors who believe that it doesn't matter what the long-term outlook is, maximize the short-term profits. Okay? And then they force action in companies to maximize short-term profits. I still remember when we were going through an activist fight in PepsiCo, one of the investors came to me and said they'd created a fund of funds where they were investing in companies being targeted by activists. Would I like to invest in this? So I'm sitting here going, wait a minute, are you serious? Do you know what I'm going through right now? But I'm saying to you because had I not been going through that activist fight, had I not been a CEO of a company, the returns on that were so spectacular. Should I have invested in that? Forget what happens after 2 years. Okay, but I could have invested in that, made a boatload of money, and cashed out. So the real challenge is, how should we look at our future? Should we look at it in terms of take the money and run? Or should we look at it in terms of we want institutions to stick around for a long time. We want job-creating asset creators. We want companies that, support communities, really keep this thing going on a sustainable basis. How do we want to look at society? How should we train investors to look at companies? I don't have the answer, Alan. I'm hoping this session will, or this forum will surface some of the answers.
I hope we do. It's easy to say, it's much harder to do, right? I mean, it is a systemic problem. I
think you can manage your shareholder base.
Fire the shareholders you don't like.
If you have shareholders that don't like what you're doing, they have options. See ya. And I've had conversations like that with investors who said, I want you to double your dividend, or I want you to buy back more stock. And I'd say, no, I want to invest in my business. And they said, well, what if we want you to? Well, you're invested in the wrong stock today. And while you may take a short-term hit because they leave, that's okay. Because I'm not in it to sell my stock tomorrow. I'm always amused by what are potential long-term changes, like the Graham-Cassidy bill that's hanging over the healthcare reform debate, which is a troubled bill. And yet, it's a 7-year time frame before any real serious cuts happen, and Wall Street's reacting like it's going to happen tomorrow. We don't have shareholders for 7 years. I'm happy to have them for 7 quarters. So what's the reaction? And I think we have to manage that shareholder base, and if you have the courage to do it, you can make it happen and get people that will support you.
I had an interesting conversation with the chairman of a large public company recently in which he said, one of the ways in which leadership has changed, particularly because things are moving so fast. If companies in the old days were information hierarchies and all the information went up to the top and the CEO made all the strategic decisions and gave the orders and the orders went back down, that doesn't work anymore. You don't have the time for that. And therefore, as a CEO, who you are almost becomes more important than what you do. Do you buy that notion?
Tell me more. What does it mean, who you are?
Well, it gets to, actually, I'd like to bring Dov Seidman in here for a minute, because we had this interesting conversation in the Vatican, Dov, where you were talking about moral leadership and how the horizontal spread of information has heightened the need for leaders to take a moral stance. I wonder if you could just elaborate on that.
Thank you, Alan. In simplistic terms, CEOs used to run human systems where they and the executive team said, these are the goals, this is what we need to get done. And everybody else's job in that system is to continue to do the next thing right. getting people to do the next thing right, you rely on your formal authority. My job and title is bigger than yours. I think formal authority has been disrupted by the forces that are disrupting everything. It's also been distrusted. We now live in a world where it's no longer about doing the next thing right, but doing the next right thing. So the role of the CEO has to change. The CEO is no longer guiding and directing, but shaping a shared consciousness and context and culture and ethos where people know what is right and every decision is animated by that purpose, which is a moral one. Now, I think the problem that we have today in society is we all know that for any system to work, we need positions of formal authority. A teacher is in charge of a classroom, a coach in charge of a team, a CEO in charge of a company. But for a system to really work, individuals with moral authority have to occupy the positions of formal authority. And we now live in a time, especially in our political system, where there is a vacuum of that. And while formal authority could be seized and won or locked up with supermajority shares, as some founders do, moral authority is really hard. It can only be earned through how you lead one day at a time or you erode it. And I think having the moral authority to take a stand or have a point of view on a social, political, or moral issue, it's no longer an option not to, but that's just table stakes. The challenge is how do you build a system, a human system, that really scales, because CEOs do still come and go. How do you create a system where moral authority is really what's running it and do it at scale? And I think that's the imperative.
So I think that's what this chairman was trying to communicate. Does that resonate with the two of you where you sit?
I mean, I saw the transcript of your conversation, Dov, which I thought was very good. Moral standard, moral by whom, is the real question we have to answer now. What used to be a moral standard has now become, based on the group you talk to, their definition of moral standards. So it's very hard for CEOs to take positions these days because whatever position you take, which you thought was the right true north in the past, is now being interpreted every which way, and so it's very hard. So the best thing is focus on running the company, do not take positions, and just make sure that you focus on your community. So I think that's a reality, Dov.
But in a way, you were taking a position when you made the decision to leave to disband the President's Advisory Council.
I didn't make the decision. The group decided that, that was the right direction. So, that was a group decision to go a certain way, and that wasn't without its challenges. And so I think we have so much to do and so little time in a day. What battle do we take on? Running the company in this time of disruption is challenging enough. Do we want to engage in other political issues? Unclear.
Yeah, I would have just a slightly different opinion that would say that the mission of the organization, we should be able to take moral positions that support the mission of the organization. Because if you speak to a mission as a company, and that's, again, the kinds of things that kind of organizations people want to work for, where there is a moral disconnect with what's going on in the environment, or even within the company, that calls into question whether or not that mission's real, you got to stand up for the mission. There are other moral positions that we don't take. I'm a member of the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. We've had a number of strong agreements with the NGLCC, but there are lines where you don't cross around religious issues, right? How do you we don't get in the middle of religious issues. We let our employees make their own religious decisions.
Well, maybe this gets back to also to the employee conversation, because when the controversy erupted in North Carolina over access to public bathrooms, I mean, that's a classic kind of issue that 10 years ago no CEO would have wanted to have anything to do with, and yet you had this succession of corporate statements ending with Bank of America, which is the largest employer in the state of North Carolina, saying this is wrong, even though I don't think access to public bathrooms was core to the business of many of those companies. So,
but it was part of our mission of diversity, right? Our tolerance of diverse populations within our organization, willing to hear from everybody, to be inclusive in that conversation.
And on top of that, with social media, people are now beginning to talk a lot more and communicate with the company a lot more. So when you get thousands of emails supporting both sides, it becomes very hard for you not to take a position because, keeping with the corporate mission of diversity, we're a North Carolina company. We had to take a position, and we did.
Yeah.
But in a consumer company in particular, with a consumer brand out there, we have to be extra careful what we do.
Yeah. Questions or comments or experiences from people in the audience? All the way in the back, please, and identify yourself.
Valery Kiselevsky, Global University Systems. On the topic of investment in human capital and the conflict or apparent conflict between long-term goals and short-term pressures, and the rise of technology, when you think about augmented reality, virtual reality, machine learning, etc., where you seem to think that you have all the incentives to invest in technology, not human capital, do you see even stronger pressure to put the investment into machines, not people? And if so, how do you resist and how do you make sure
this has to be a big issue at your company. A lot of the things that Aetna does today will probably be automated 15, 20 years ago.
And we're automating every time. What you have to do is you have to think about how do we think about work, and we define work. More than 50% of our workforce now works from home full time. They work online. They're connected to our technology. We can monitor their quality. We can monitor their productivity. Do they have to work for us, work for Aetna? Could they be doing that work elsewhere? As we look at getting into the home, where most of social determinants are most evident, getting away from the exam table to find out what's wrong, or what do we need to do to help a member, getting to the kitchen table. That's not going to be an Aetna representative knocking on the door saying, hi, I'm here from Aetna, I'm here to help. It really needs to be somebody in the community that we hire, and we allow, and they know that person, they can get into the home and they can give us the information we have. The Meals on Wheels person, for example, that we work with in Florida and Texas. So the idea is, can we reinvent work where we're paying for the quality of the service provided versus the hours worked? And does that create an economy where we have individuals, gig economy is one of the words that's used today, where individuals have more leisure time, they're at home with their families, they have opportunity to help the economy in many different ways than the way we structure it today. And so we have to look beyond the technology to the human capital and say, what kind of life do you want to lead and what's good for the economy in the whole for that to happen, and including the individual themselves.
That is the topic of one of the working groups we'll have this afternoon. Indra, a quick last comment?
I think that we're at an interesting time in the role, in defining the role of the CEO. I think the pressures on the CEO are going up, while the need for CEOs to exercise moral leadership is also being forced upon that CEO. I think it's important that the media world also is careful in reporting about CEOs, because when CEOs do take a stance on something, rather than sensationalize it, I think it's important we report it in a very fair and straightforward way. I think that'll help the CEO do the job a whole lot better.
We'll try and take that advice in the best way. Thank you very much. Great conversation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.